Hello, and welcome to the 2023 Global DEI Conference, a transformative platform for DEI presented by Ludo and One Business World. Thank you for joining us for a dynamic convergence of global thought leaders and change makers as we really foster the conversation around equity and shape the future for a more inclusive workplace together. I'd like to now welcome Brian, who is the CEO and founder of Hummingbird Humanity. Great to have you here with us, Brian. Over to you.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. And hello to everyone out there joining us today. Thank you for being with us. And thank you to One Business World and Ludo for inviting me to share at this conference. And I hope that what I offer today will be helpful for the work that you're doing in your organizations and your workplaces. And one of the things that I believe is we're all trying to, in this space, we're trying to figure out how do we make change happen, and how do we create workplaces that are more inclusive, equitable, and diverse. And so that's what I'll share with you today is a framework that I've developed that may be helpful for you, and if it is, great. But as always, take what works for you and leave the rest. So there's lots of right answers here that I think we can all borrow from as we're learning from each other at a conference like this, the Global DEI conference we're all at today. So let's kick off with talking about the 4 lenses of representation, which is a framework that I developed when I was working at Tapestry as the global head of inclusion. Tapestry, for anyone who may not know, is the home of Coach Kate Spade and Stuart Weitzman. And when I started working at Tapestry, one of the frameworks that when I started working as the global head of inclusion at Tapestry, one of the frameworks that I started to see really commonly used in the DEI space was the workforce, workplace, community framework. And many of you may be using that framework or may have seen that framework. And as I was starting to really bring that, use that framework and bring it to life at Tapestry, I realized that there was a lens missing, and that was the lens of customers. And so I wanted to really bring in that customer component into how we were thinking about our DEI strategy at Tapestry. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. But that's really where this framework emerged, was in that role and during that time of how do we really make sure that our employees can see themselves and our customers can see themselves represented in everything that we do. So more to come on that. So let's pause there and take a step back. When was the first time you had a teacher who looked like you? For me, as a white cisgender man, that was probably back in kindergarten, maybe even in preschool. Now, most likely, I say that age, that most likely they were women. Those are the images that emerged for me, is that teachers were women and they were white women. But when I talk to my friends and colleagues who are people of color, it was much later in their lives when they had a teacher that looked like them. And I know this is a global conference, so I just want to acknowledge that these stats here are for the United States. 1 in 2 public school students are people of color. And yet only 1 in 5 of teachers in public school are people of color. So what message does that send to these young people when they don't see people that look like themselves in those roles of authority, which when you're going to school, that's a key role in your life, is your teacher. When there's this mismatch in representation, we also see that there's a 20% increase in suspensions for students with racially mismatched teachers. So when we play the last slide out into this slide out, what that means is, particularly for students of color, there's a 20% increase in suspensions. And those suspensions are also moments where those young people don't have the opportunity to learn like their peers. And so it starts the marginalization of their experience that will take them to the workplace later on in life. It starts at very early in their lives. So now let's fast forward from those early years of school to life in our workplaces. When was the last time you had a manager who looked like you? I think back to a time when when I started my career in human resources, which was almost 30 years ago now at Red Lobster. And I was just come out a couple years prior as a gay man. And I had to make a decision about whether I was going to be out in my role in HR at Red Lobster or whether I was going to go back in the closet. Sadly, the story is that I went back in the closet, and because I just didn't know whether I could be successful as an HR professional or as a professional in corporate America, and also be gay. The good news for me, though, was I had a manager in that department who was a gay man who figured out that I had a story to tell and made space and room for me to be able to share my identity and my lived experience. And what Kim, his name is Kim, and what Kim did then is not only was he an openly gay man who was on the path to a promotional path to the next level in his career, he was a rising star at the company. He also helped me see other senior level leaders in the organization that were out and as gay individuals and very successful, which included at that time the successor to our CEO of the company, who was an out lesbian. And so that was a really pivotal and poignant moment for me in my career. And I also know that so many of our colleagues that we work with don't have that same opportunity, and that may include many of you. So why does this conversation around representation, why is it important to me? I've mentioned a few parts of my identity already. I am a white cisgender man. I am, which means in these workplace environments, the structures and systems that exist are largely built to elevate and promote people who look like me. I also, so I recognize that there's privilege and power that comes with that, and I try to use that privilege and opportunity to influence others as a way as I do this work to really drive changes in organizations and particularly systems that hold people back. At the same time, I'm also, as I mentioned before, I'm gay, and I'm also disabled. I have 3 invisible disabilities that are part of my life every day. One of those is that I live with anxiety and depression, and living with anxiety and depression is for those of you who deal with mental health challenges will certainly understand, or if you have friends or loved ones who you've gone through these moments with, can be really mental health can be really challenging for anyone to deal with in life, just as a starting point. But helping people understand the pain and the suffering that you may be going through when they can't see it, when it's not tangible, is a really difficult proposition. And particularly when in those moments where you're like, I'm really lost right now, and I'm in a deep episode of depression. How do I even tell that story? I don't even know how to tell the story to myself, much less tell it to someone else and help them understand it and help them access what it's like to be in that moment. And there was a moment in my career in my time at L'Oreal, who I worked with, great group of colleagues, and I had one of these episodes of depression. And what I know looking back is I physically showed up to work every day, but I wasn't really there. And I'm sure that it was frustrating for my colleagues. So they saw me there physically. They also saw that I wasn't doing everything I needed to do, and that someone had to help and cover those pieces of the work that I wasn't covering. And they didn't understand why. And I wonder if I could go back, could I tell them a story that was a different story, to say, here's what's happening for me, and figure out a path towards how they can be part of the solution and have access to to what's happening. I'm confident they would have been very supportive, but they can't be supportive if they don't know the story. I think it's an interesting question for us about what's going to be the right answer as we continue these conversations going forward, of how do we tell those stories, what's right for workplaces, what's appropriate, what feels comfortable for each person might be different from from one person to the next. But that's why this is really important to me, because I've had these experiences where I've been marginalized, I've been othered, I've had moments where I'm like, I wonder if that could be different. What would that look like? And I realized that I have privilege and I really want to be part of the change. So that's a little bit about what representation means to me, and why this, like being here and part of this work, which I love, but it's the hardest work ever. And many of you will probably agree with me, why it's so important for me to be here and to be part of this change. So let's talk about the 4 lenses of representation. What we know is that the nature of work is evolving, and that we are seeing that the workforce of today is already more diverse than certainly a few years ago, and that will continue to accelerate as we move forward. So we have 1 in 5 young adults identify as queer, and 1 in 4 Americans lives with a disability. The nature of work is evolving as well, and that that means that not only as as the workforce changes identity and evolves, and the representation of these different communities, what also is going to emerge is that we're going to have to rethink some of the, not only the systems of oppression we're talking about today, but some of those policies and programs that we offer that don't meet the needs of all of our employees. I have to think about the holiday calendars that we use in so many of our organizations, which are still centered around the Christian holiday calendar and don't honor several of the other religions that are so important. And certainly I've seen that impact on those employees in workplaces. So how do we start to rethink some of those decisions that are so standard and embedded in our organizations? What does that look like? This is a framework that you'll have all seen before, and how the diversity, equity, inclusion comes together to really elevate and center on the experience of belonging. And what I think is really important here is to really for us to think about not only the framework, which many of us will already be familiar with, but is how are we using this framework to spark new conversations around the identities that are entering our organizations either today or what our organizations are going to look like tomorrow. And the thing that I find really challenging here, and I would love to say that I have the answer to this puzzle, but I don't yet. But I think it's important to acknowledge that our leaders are rewarded for results that they deliver today, and the reality is this type of change that we're working to drive is change that needs to happen over the course of time. It's not overnight, it's over time. So how do we have these conversations around creating diverse, equitable, inclusive environments where people feel like they belong? And how do we make this change that is so meaningful and so important transpire over the course of time, while also honoring that our leaders are rewarded for delivering results today? And so I think that's one of these conversations that I'm having and really enjoying, and finding the puzzle looks on the faces of everyone in the room around, well, how do we do that? And if any of you have any suggestions or ideas, I would love to hear them. We also know that our employees are demanding action on DEI, and more than ever, they want to be part of how organizations are run and how the decisions are made in those organizations. So we all know that this is more than checking a box. Representation encompasses so many different aspects of our lived experience. This is the human iceberg, which many of you may be familiar with visible identities and invisible identities, really be surfacing in these conversations in ways that they never did before in our workplaces. So we need to reframe representation, and that's where the 4 lenses comes into play. The 4 lenses are people, culture, customers, and community. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it was workplace community was the framework that I was using originally when I joined or started my work in the DEI space, and we reframed this to be people, culture, customers, and community. Now, in my version 2.0 of this framework, I'm going to reorder the first 2, because really culture must come first, and then we start to work on people, and then customers and community when you're developing the framework. But the framework is really not only how do we expand the framework to include customers, it is intended to drive a conversation around how DEI work is not something else, but it is part of everything. So how do our DEI initiatives and strategies, how do they touch every aspect of our organization? And the question that I ask our clients, particularly when we're having these conversations around the 4 lenses and how they come to life in their organizations, the question I ask them to think about is at the individual level. Can Elizabeth see herself reflected in this organization? Can Brian see himself reflected in this organization? Can so on? Can each person see themselves reflected in the imagery, the messaging, the policies and programs? How do they know that they're seen and valued and heard through our decisions, our approaches, our tactics, our strategies that we develop and implement in each of these 4 lenses of representation? So let's I'm going to put this slide up here, which just adds a little bit more color to each of those 4 lenses. And one thing that I'll offer here that which will be explained better in I think than our current materials, And the version 2.0 of this framework is how to define customers if you're a B2B organization. And most of our clients who are B2B organizations, how they define customers is they look at their vendors and partners, the partners and vendors they work with. So it's those external partners who have a really tangible connection to the organization and how they operate, how they do what they do. So let's just go through a few different examples here. And as we are thinking about reframing representation. So reframing people, how are you expanding your talent pool to include people with disabilities could be one of the questions you might ask. And when I think about this concept of lenses, one thing that is part of the work and the way that we do this work with our clients is to always ask the next question. So how are you expanding our talent pool? Does the organization for people with disabilities, does the organization, does it support the growth and development of people with disabilities? Okay, well, we're saying people with disabilities. That's a very large community that's very diverse. What are we talking about? Are we talking about people that are maybe live in a wheelchair, like the character or the person depicted here? Or are we talking about someone who has some mental health challenges, like myself? What are the disabilities we're talking about, and what are the steps we want to take? For each of these 4 lenses and these examples that I'm going to share today, we'll have one example of a company or an organization that's one of the tactics or programs that they have brought to life. So this one is Microsoft, and they developed a program to hire people with autism, and working with autism advocates to develop that program. So you'll see a little bit about that program here, but the outcomes were they created a different pathway to engage this community of individuals so that they could find opportunities to be employed by Microsoft. And then Microsoft found this great group of employees to do work in ways that made a difference for their organization, but also allowed them to give back and be part of the change that needed to happen. Reframing culture. How are you creating a culture where employees can share what matters most to them? One of the things that I like to say, or I don't really like to say, but I say a lot, is that when I first started my career in corporate America, I knew when I walked into that first day in my first job at Red Lobster that I needed to take off what I call my coat of emotions. Nobody said that to me. Nobody told me that, but I did know that my humanity needed to be left at the door. And, I think the reality is that's problematic and challenging for all of us. And the reality is our humanity comes with us. Everything that happens in our lives is part of who we are, and it influences how we show up, and it influences how we do our work. Not to say that we should spend all day at work talking about our humanity and life and some of the realities that life can bring to us as in both challenges or moments of success and joy. But we should be able to access it and share that with our colleagues in ways that will be helpful for us as to work together collaboratively and within ways that we can trust each other and understand each other and then see each other with a full picture of who we are as both humans and professionals. The example on the screen here is for Vital Smarts, which I think is a great example of certainly, and I like this story here. I'm going to mention one of our clients, Octane Lending. Octane, for their speaker series, they created a speaker series that was focused on elevating employee stories around identity, but they did it by borrowing from the Moth podcast, if any of you've listened to the Moth. And so they use a version of the Moth storytelling approach to bring their diversity speaker series to life. And it's been hugely successful for them and really resonated with their employee population. Reframing customers. How does your content highlight a diverse set of voices and perspectives? So how does your social media messaging or content, how do your marketing materials, does your website look homogenous? Are the images or the people that are represented there, are they diverse? Is it a homogenous group? Are you telling stories about the ways that you're honoring diversity and inclusion? What does that look like? And what would someone externally to your organization see when they were looking at your imagery and your external content and messaging? We can share this separately afterwards. This is a video of a Coca-Cola ad that was shared in 2014 with Super Bowl, or during the Super Bowl, titled "It's Beautiful." And It features a diverse community of individuals who live in the United States and who are singing this beautiful song. And it's a really powerful commercial, and in the images are beautiful. And it's also one that caused some challenges. There were conversations that emerged about whether that was really honoring America in the way that it should honor America. And certainly I think it does, but I think it was a great example of not everyone is really ready for this conversation to happen, which we all know. And it was great that a company like Coca-Cola took that step to say, we're going to do this beautiful ad, this beautiful message that honors the diversity of the United States, and we're going to spark some conversation. And I think that's really, really wonderful, and certainly still worth mentioning today. We have about 3 to 4 minutes left for my presentation. I know Elizabeth's going to come back with any questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to get those ready. Reframing community. How can your company provide volunteering opportunities with community organizations? So giving back, philanthropy, volunteerism, social impact efforts, those are so important to this conversation around creating diverse, equitable, inclusive environments. And they're important to your employees, as many of us will already know. Our employees are looking to be part of organizations that have a commitment to purpose and want to make a difference in the world. And here we have premium service brands saw a problem in their community and really help to a school down the street from their office provides lunches to some of the kids there. So again, these are the 4 lenses. I know this is a fast presentation. Hopefully, it again just offers some insights, some ways of thinking. Perhaps the framework would be helpful for you and how you are developing your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic roadmap. And what we'll certainly share the slides after the presentation, as well as we have a thought leadership paper that really brings this framework to life in a variety of ways, both through stats and figures, which are important in how we think about how this is an approach that is how diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are both impactful to the business, but they also that paper also illuminates the stories of real humans and how representation has really mattered to them. When you understand representation holistically, you work towards becoming a human-centered organization. And that's how we really at Hummingbird think about this work in DEI. We've started to use language around human-centered workplace cultures, and how do we honor this holistic perspective of our humanity with not only DEI practices, but also well-being practices and purpose orientation. So how do we think about it through that broader lens, and recognizing that all those elements of human-centered workplaces, they really work together. Just like we talk about DEI as part of everything, it needs to touch everything in the ecosystem, and then the enterprise. The reality is human-centered organizations need to be honoring our humanity, as well as the importance of how we honor our humanity, how that can make an impact on the success of our business. And as I mentioned, we'll share this afterwards. These are just some self-reflection questions that you might use for yourselves, or maybe with your team or colleagues that you work with back at the office, to start thinking about how this framework really comes to life in your organization. So if you'd like to connect with us, feel free to scan the QR code here. There'll be a short form you can fill in and share your information with us. This is particularly helpful if you want to connect with me and have a conversation. Feel free to reach out using that form, and we'll make sure to follow up with you to schedule time. And here is my information to connect with me. So again, Elizabeth, thank you so much for inviting me, and all of you out there, thank you so much for being with us today. If you're watching later, thank you for watching, and I hope this was helpful for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was honestly brilliant. And there was a couple of things that I just wanted to wrap around on that really jumped out for me. This piece about being human-centered and culture coming first. We talk about people first, but actually, as you rightly said, can I see myself reflected in this business? Does this culture feel like a safe place for me? I can belong here. And that really resonated for me. Of course, like you, I'm an HR professional, and just how we see that through the lens of our people in the organization. I thought that was really powerful. And also just a thank you for being vulnerable and, speaking your truth in true essence of self, and demonstrating that actually being in your true self and speaking out is a great way to invite that vulnerability in others. So just a huge thank you. That was great, Brian. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, and sharing my stories is certainly something that has I've developed comfort and confidence with over time, and I still have my moments of angst when I share a part of my story. When I have those moments of angst, though, I try to remember a moment where I've had the opportunity to impact another person's life. And I remember that one night I was at dinner with several friends. We were all gay men, and I was sharing about that I was HIV positive and the challenges with dating and being HIV positive. And it was just a typical dinner night with friends, and a conversation that was very normal to I thought everyone at the table. And the next day, one of my friends that was there showed up at my door. And no one shows up at anyone's door these days without a call first, but he showed up at my door, and I opened the door, and he burst into tears. And what he shared with me was that he had never heard someone speak about being HIV positive in such a everyday way, like it was just part of their lives, which is really how it was for me, and it is for me today. But for him, it was something that he was had a lot of shame about, and a lot of fear and guilt, and he just couldn't share it externally with anyone else. And so he lived with this secret that was really, really difficult and powerful for him to navigate through it in life every day. And so that was a moment where I got to change his life, hopefully, and give him another example of what it can look like to live with being HIV positive. And those moments happen on a regular basis when I share my story. And I think it's so important for us to find ways to as you've said, to help people feel seen. So whether that's through storytelling or whether it's through the decisions we make in our organizations, or both, ideally, I think it's really important for us to honor our humanity in everything that we do.
I could not agree more. And thank you so much for sharing that. Brian, it has been an incredible joy. And thank you for all of your vulnerability and your openness and the great work you're doing. Thank you.